video an introduction to merger control. So let me outline what we're going to talk about in this video. First, what is a concentration or merger? Second, what are the different types of mergers? Third, why do firms merge? And finally, we're looking at whether or not there's a trend towards greater market concentration and how much impact has had the type of enforcement in the past 2 decades on this trend. So let's start with what is a concentration. Let's take 2 firms, Alpha and Beta, and Alpha acquires 100% shareholding of Beta. Now, before the concentration, we had 2 independent firms. Following the concentration, we have a single economic unit. This is what we call an acquisition of control. Now, a concentration involves 2 or more undertakings or parts of undertakings that were formerly independent being brought under unitary control. For merger control purposes, the goal is really to identify any possible negative impacts on competition, and so a merger is the joint So concentration involves 2 or more undertakings or parts of undertakings that were formerly independent being brought under unitary control. Because merger control is focused on the economic impact on competition, it doesn't really matter how control is achieved. In other words, a concentration involves integration of 2 independent economic units in a single entity. Mergers are also commonly referred as concentrations. No. Concentrations are usually called mergers, although technically merger is just a form of concentration, as we will see. The scope of control, as I said, is the impact on competition of the permanent change of market structure that has been brought about by the concentration. Now, let's look at other forms of concentration. And here again, we have firms Alpha and Beta. But in this scenario, Alpha and Beta merge and form a new company, Alpha Beta. So this is an actual merger as a form of concentration. You will notice that the effect is the same in the sense that 2 previously economically independent units have now been brought under sole unitary control. Now, a different type of transaction that is also considered a concentration involves the setting up of joint ventures. So in this scenario, Alpha and Beta create a new firm called Gamma, which is controlled equally on 50% shares, and so it forms a joint venture. In this case, we have joint control. So Gamma is controlled both by Alpha and Beta, and neither Alpha nor Beta is able to exercise sole control over Gamma. A second form of joint venture is where Alpha already has an existing subsidiary, Gamma, controlled by 100%, and now Alpha and Beta, following the transaction, will each control 50% of Gamma, thus forming a joint venture. Now, let's look at the nature of the merger. First, horizontal mergers. Now, horizontal mergers involve the firms that operate in the same market. In this case, we have these 4 firms that are competing in market A. Now, let's assume that Alpha and Beta merge, forming Alpha Beta. In this scenario, we used to have 4 competitors, now we have 3 competitors, plus they're all similarly sized, they all have the same market share. This increases the risk of coordinated effects, that is to say, the risk of collusion. Let's look at another scenario, and again we have 4 competitors. But in this case, Gamma and Delta have merged to form Gamma Delta. Now these were the 2 largest firms in the market, and now they've given rise to the by far largest competitor in the market. So in addition to the reduction of the number of competitors, we also have the risk of creating a dominant position, something that, as we will see, we call unilateral effects in terms of competition analysis of mergers. Vertical mergers. Now, vertical mergers involve different levels of the value chain. And we're going to look at the value chain of the beer industry and also to the vertically related segment of cafes, hotels, and restaurants. Okay, so let's consider the value chain of the beer industry where we have production, wholesaler distribution, retail, and finally, consumers. Now, in this value chain, a vertical merger would involve the levels of production and wholesaler distribution, for instance. So let's consider that we have 3 beer producers and 2 wholesaler distributors in a given market. And let's now assume that Delta acquires Kappa, thus acquiring full control over this distributor. Now, because Delta has a very high market share, and the same goes for Kappa, this may lead to the creation of a barrier to entry in the market for beer and beer distribution, as Alpha and Beta may now be excluded from the distribution network of Kappa, and as you can see, Kappa represents 80% of the market, and Pi, the only distributor available, has a 20% market share, which is quite obviously incapable of supporting the both Alpha and Beta in terms of the output of their production. Conglomerate mergers. Now, conglomerate mergers involve 2 normally completely unrelated markets, in this example, beer producers and air transport companies. So a merger between Delta and Lambda, resulting in an integration of these 2 firms through acquisition of control, would lead to what we call a pure conglomerate. That is to say, there is really no relation between these 2 different markets. It's normally the result of a strategy to minimize risk by diversifying investments in different industries that have different economic cycles. Other conglomerates may give rise to concerns, to competitive concerns. Let's assume that we are now talking about 2 different markets, but that they are related to each other. And let's consider again beer production and now mineral water producers. Now, in this scenario, if Delta buys Lambda and integrates it into its firm, now through the acquisition of control, now this will create the competitive risks in the fact that both of these producers sell through the same market. That is to say, retail like cafes, hotels, and restaurants. So Delta and Lambda together have higher bargaining power with regard to these cafes, hotels, and restaurants, and may thus foreclose their competitors in either market or actually on both markets. Now, why do firms merge? I'm going to give you a short overview of some of the reasons why firms merge by looking at what are sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly reasons for merging. So in the good side, we have the need to enter a market or to expand presence, to the exercise of freedom to exit the market, and finally, the market for corporate control. Here, this relies on the idea that capital markets operate efficiently, and so if you have an incumbent management in a firm that is performing badly because they are not extracting enough value for shareholders, then the mere existence of a market whereby that firm may be taken over by another will create incentives to align in the management with the shareholders' interests. Now, as for bad, obviously, one of the bad motives is to eliminate actual potential competitors, as well as to increase market power. Often, however, mergers also rely on different types of motives. These might be to avoid being taken over by another firm, so-called defensive acquisitions, to achieve speculative gains and tax breaks, or simply to pursue megalomaniac plans, as some big mergers that have failed historically demonstrate. Now, Is there a trend towards increasing market concentration? Let's look at some of the largest transactions ever. Now, in 2008, the acquisition of Anheuser-Busch by InBev, creating the world's largest beer producer, was a mega transaction reaching a value of $60 billion US. In 2015, the merger between Kraft and Heinz reached a transaction of the value of $107 billion. The same year, a very controversial transaction, the merger between Dow and DuPont, two large chemical companies, reached a transaction value of $137 billion. But much earlier in the century, in the year 2000, the merger between AOL and Time Warner was one of the mega deals reaching $240 billion. But the top one is the merger between the German group Mannesmann and Vodafone in 1999, a deal that reached $303 billion US. Now, is there a trend towards increasing concentration? Well, this graph gives you an overview of deals that go from above 5 billion in the top row to deals that are lower than 500 million, the lower row. You can see in this curve that the activity, the merger activity, tends to follow the overall pattern of the economy. So there was a significant reduction of mergers during the financial crisis, and other crises are also shown in the decline of merger activity. One of the significant aspects, though, is the fact that these very large transactions, over $5 billion, as you can see, have represented a very significant number of transactions in the past 2 decades. Another concerning fact is the participation of investment funds, firms that invest for monetary reasons in order to achieve rewards on their investments, but they often invest in the same industry. So they may be shareholders of, say, the 5 largest banks in Portugal. This means that looking strictly at ownership in terms of control may not give you a complete picture. That is why some analysts have developed what is called the modified HHI, which we will see in another video, is an index to measure the degree of horizontal concentration to adjust it for common ownership. And as you can see in this graph, in some industries, this leads to very, very significant concentration in markets that go from manufacturing to wholesale trade and retail trade, services, mining, transportation, construction, and financial markets as well. And here in this other graph, we can again look at the trend towards increasing concentration over the period since the decades beginning in the 1980s up to 2012. In terms of market share by firm, this is an overview of US market share, so it applies only to the United States, but we can see that in these selected markets, there is quite clearly a trend towards greater and greater concentration, with very clear market leaders in the bottom row, like Google in the market for search engines, with a market share of over 60%. This is followed by very few competitors, thus indicating that many of these markets are trending to become either monopolies or at least duopolies or strict oligopolies. Contrasting to this trend is the decline of antitrust enforcement, quite clearly so in the United States, as this graph on the left shows, but also in other parts of the world, and this would also include the European Union. One such example is the fact that the acquisition of WhatsApp by Facebook was cleared by the European Commission, something that it came to regret, as there were clearly competitive links between these two firms, and the merger may have operated to the detriment of the public interest and of consumers. So at the same time that we see this trend in the past 2 decades towards increasing concentration in the US economy, The evidence in terms of enforcement shows very, very significant reduction of enforcement, particularly when compared with the mid-1990s, the period when we had the Clinton administration in the United States. In terms of the share of investigated mergers that have been blocked and the number of remaining competitors, we can see that merger enforcement with regard has been mostly concentrated in mergers that would lead to have only between 1 and 3 competitors. Also a significant involvement in cases where mergers would lead to four competitors, and a virtual absence of enforcement with regard to mergers that would lead to 5 or 6 or 7 competitors. And so this concludes this presentation, and I look forward to discussing it in class with you. Thank you.